Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold is remembered as the ultimate traitor, the man who turned his back on the American Revolution. But what if, from his point of view, his actions were actually justified? What if he truly believed he was doing the right thing? Before he ever changed sides, Arnold wasn't some shadowy figure waiting to betray the cause. He was one of the most effective generals America had. At Saratoga, his leadership played a critical role in securing victory, a victory so important it helped convince France to join the revolution. Without French support, the entire fight for independence might not have survived. So how does a man who fought that hard end up wearing the label of traitor? At the beginning, Arnold was all in. He believed in the cause, but over time things soured. Congress passed him over for promotion again and again, giving rewards to officers who were less capable but better connected. The resentment only deepened after Saratoga. Arnold had thrown himself into a reckless but brilliant charge, and in the chaos he was shot in the left leg, the same leg he'd already injured in Quebec. The bone was shattered. He nearly lost the limb. Months of painful recovery followed, and when he returned, the government treated him not as a hero, but with suspicion, and what he saw as contempt. And it wasn't just personal slights. Arnold truly believed the revolution was being mismanaged, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Congress was broke and constantly arguing. Supplies weren't reaching the soldiers. Officers were quitting because they hadn't been paid in months. Arnold himself had spent his own money to cover military costs and was now buried in debt. He began to argue that the revolution had been hijacked by politicians looking out for themselves. To him, continuing the fight would only bring more suffering, more chaos, maybe even the collapse into mob rule. So when the British reached out, offering him money and a position in their army, and the chance to help end the war, he listened. And in his mind, it wasn't just about greed. He genuinely believed that siding with Britain could restore order, protect property, and maybe even save lives. By 1780, Arnold made his move. He agreed to turn over the American fort at West Point to the British in exchange for money and a commission. The plan fell apart at the last moment, and Arnold barely escaped, fleeing behind British lines. From then on, he was condemned as a traitor by the very country he had once risked everything to create. But here's the twist. Arnold didn't see himself as betraying America. He thought he was saving it. So the real question isn't just whether Benedict Arnold was a traitor. The question is, if you truly believed the revolution had already been lost to corruption, what would be the right thing to do? It's the kind of question that echoes through history. To some people, Edward Snowden is a whistleblower who exposed illegal surveillance. To others, he's a traitor. Arnold's story reminds us, it all depends on which side of history you're standing on. Edward Snowden. To some, he's the man who endangered national security. To others, he's the whistleblower who pulled back the curtain on government surveillance. Before the media storm and his eventual exile in Russia, Snowden was just a systems contractor working for the NSA. He held top-level clearance and had access to some of the most sensitive intelligence programs in the United States. And what he saw shook him. It wasn't just about tracking terrorists overseas. The NSA was sweeping up massive amounts of data on ordinary Americans, emails, phone calls, text messages, often without warrants. Oversight came from secret courts and closed-door committees, not open public debate. Snowden believed the American people had a right to know how far things had gone, especially in the years after 9/11. So in 2013, he made his move. Snowden leaked a huge collection of classified documents to journalists. The reaction was instant and explosive. The government charged him under the Espionage Act. Intelligence officials branded him a traitor. Snowden fled, first to Hong Kong, then to Russia. That choice drew plenty of criticism, given Russia's own record on surveillance, but Snowden said it was the only way to avoid a lifetime in prison. Here's where the story gets complicated. Years later, multiple courts, including a U.S. federal court, ruled that some of the surveillance programs Snowden exposed were, in fact, unconstitutional. His leaks sparked real change. Tech companies overhauled encryption. Congress passed the USA Freedom Act, limiting bulk data collection. And worldwide privacy became a much bigger part of the conversation. And here's something important. Snowden didn't sell secrets to a foreign power. He didn't do it for money. He handed documents to journalists, letting them decide what should be made public. His stated goal was simple: to force a debate about government power in the digital age. Did he break the law? No question. Did he damage national security? Maybe, though the government has never shown clear evidence of lives lost or missions ruined because of the leaks. But what's undeniable is that he also exposed the government breaking its own laws and lying to the public about it. For some, that makes Edward Snowden a traitor. For others, it makes him a patriot. Either way, his name remains one of the most controversial in modern American history. Wang Jingwei. He's remembered as the man who led a Japanese-backed puppet regime in Nanjing, even while China was still fighting against Japan's brutal occupation. From most angles, that looks like treason. But here's the thing. Wang wasn't just some fringe opportunist. Early in his life, he had been a top revolutionary, a close ally of Sun Yat-sen, and one of the founding leaders of China's nationalist movement. He had fought for Chinese independence, not Japanese domination. So the obvious question is, why did he switch sides? By the late 1930s, China was being crushed under Japan's invasion. Cities were reduced to rubble. Millions of lives had already been lost. Wang, who had clashed with Chiang Kai-shek as early as 1938 over whether to pursue peace talks, came to believe that resisting Japan with a fractured leadership and scarce resources was a losing battle. In his eyes, pushing forward would only bring endless bloodshed and destruction. So in 1940, he broke away and formed a rival government under Japanese protection. Wang argued that he wasn't betraying China, but trying to save it. He claimed that if Japan's victory was inevitable, then cooperating could at least preserve Chinese institutions and spare its people from complete ruin. To him, negotiation, no matter how humiliating, was better than annihilation. But here's where reality crushed that vision. Japan had no real interest in Chinese autonomy. Wang's government was a shell, a facade. While he believed diplomacy might soften the blow for his people, Japan carried on with forced labor, massacres, and relentless brutality across occupied territories. That's why Wang's actions have been judged, not as pragmatic but as cowardly. Because whatever his intentions, he gave legitimacy to an invading power. And in the end, his collaboration propped up Japan's occupation of China. Wang Jingwei died in Nagoya, Japan in 1944, before the war was over. Afterward, his name in China became cemented as a traitor. Yet the lingering question remains. Was Wang really selling out his country? Or was he desperately trying to save it from what he believed was inevitable destruction? And maybe the harder question is this. Does it matter if betrayal comes from desperation instead of ambition? Marcus Junius Brutus. Marcus Junius Brutus was right at the center of one of history's most famous betrayals. To Brutus, Julius Caesar wasn't just another politician or even just a dictator. He was his mentor, his political patron, maybe even a father figure. And still, Brutus was one of the men who drove a knife into Caesar's chest on the floor of the Roman Senate. Why would he do it? Brutus believed, or at least claimed to believe, that Caesar was about to destroy the Roman Republic, that he was turning a government built on laws and shared power into a monarchy with himself on the throne. And to be fair, he wasn't wrong. Caesar had declared himself dictator for life. He'd bypassed the Senate and gathered power in ways that made Rome's elites panic. Brutus saw himself as a protector of the Republic, a guardian of the old order. He thought that by killing Caesar, Rome could return to its system of checks and balances, where no one man held absolute power. But that's not how it played out. With Caesar gone, chaos filled the void. Civil war broke out. Blood spilled across the empire, and out of that chaos rose Caesar's heir, Octavian, who would go on to become Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome. In other words, Brutus's attempt to save the Republic may have only sped up its collapse. The truth is, Rome's system was already cracking under the weight of rival generals, ambitious warlords, and a restless army. And the Roman people? They didn't rally to the so-called liberators. They mourned Caesar. 2 years later, after losing the Battle of Philippi, Brutus took his own life. So was Brutus a cold-blooded backstabber? Or was he a tragic idealist, someone who truly thought he was saving Rome, only to help bring about the very empire he feared? Claus von Stauffenberg was a man who tried to destroy the Nazi regime from the inside. He wasn't some fringe radical or a double agent. He was a high-ranking officer, born into an old aristocratic family, a decorated veteran, and for much of his life a believer in German nationalism. But as the war dragged on and the sheer scale of Nazi brutality became undeniable, something changed. Stauffenberg saw the mass executions. He read the reports coming back from the Eastern Front, and he made a decision. Staying loyal meant becoming complicit. So in July of 1944, he took action. Stauffenberg walked into Hitler's command center carrying a briefcase bomb. He set it just a few feet from Hitler, walked out, and waited. Moments later, the bomb exploded. But fate wasn't on his side. A heavy oak table shielded Hitler from the blast. He survived with only minor injuries. Within hours, the plot unraveled. Stauffenberg was arrested and executed that very night. At the time, the Nazi propaganda machine branded him a coward, a traitor, a disgrace to the uniform. His name was meant to be synonymous with betrayal. But history has a way of changing its verdicts. In post-war Germany, Stauffenberg's legacy flipped. Today, you'll find his face on memorials, statues, even schools. The resistance he led is remembered not as treason, but as one of the rare acts of moral courage in a regime defined by terror. In the end, Claus von Stauffenberg tried to give Germany a second chance, even if it meant being remembered as a traitor. And for a time, that's exactly what he was. When you hear the name Guy Fawkes today, you probably think of a mask, a symbol of resistance, protest, rebellion. But the real Guy Fawkes? His plan was simple and deadly. He wanted to blow up the English Parliament, kill the king, and spark a Catholic uprising to seize the throne. The year was 1605. England was officially Protestant, and Catholics were being fined, imprisoned, even executed just for practicing their faith. Fawkes and a small circle of conspirators believed peaceful appeals had failed. In their minds, the only way to end persecution was through force, total regime change. Their logic was brutal. If the king won't listen, maybe he'll feel it. So Fawkes packed 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords, enough to wipe out Parliament, King James III's, the royal family, and most of the government in a single blast. But the explosion never came. The authorities had been tipped off. Fawkes was caught red-handed guarding the powder. He was tortured, sentenced to death, and led to the scaffold. But even then he refused to give the executioner the satisfaction. Always the rebel, Guy Fawkes jumped from the gallows and broke his own neck before the rope could do its work. So what was he? A freedom fighter? Or a religious extremist with a short fuse? It depends on how you look at it. He fought against persecution and for religious liberty. But his solution was a mass casualty attack. He resisted tyranny, but only to try and install another. Centuries later, his story took on a life of its own. That face, that mask, resurfaced, first in comic books, then in films, and eventually in global protests. Guy Fawkes became less of a man and more of a symbol. A reminder that rebellion, for better or worse, always leaves a mark. Philippe Pétain was once a hero. In World War I, he was the savior of Verdun, the general who held the line when France was on the edge of collapse. But by 1940, in World War II, he was back in the spotlight, older, slower, and this time leading a nation already broken. France had fallen to Nazi Germany in just 6 weeks. The government collapsed, the army was shattered, Paris was occupied, and Pétain was brought in as the steady hand during the emergency. His answer was simple: surrender. He signed an armistice with Hitler. To his supporters, Pétain claimed he was shielding France from total destruction. Collaboration, he argued, was necessary to preserve French identity, to save at least some shred of sovereignty. Resistance, he warned, would only bring annihilation. So the government packed up, moved to Vichy, and began cooperating with the Nazis. It was supposed to be survival, but survival came at a cost. Under Pétain, France passed anti-Semitic laws, rounded up Jews, and handed dissidents to the Gestapo. Whatever the justification, The Vichy regime wasn't just protecting France, it was enforcing Nazi policies, helping the occupiers tighten their grip. After the war, France didn't see a protector. They saw a traitor. Pétain was tried, convicted of treason, and sentenced to death. Only his age spared him from execution. So the question lingers, was Pétain's bargain a desperate attempt to save his country? Or did survival lose its meaning once it required becoming the monster you claim to resist? John Brown. John Brown believed slavery was such a moral crime that it could only be ended with violence. And in 1859, he decided to prove it. He led a raid on a federal armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal wasn't small. He wanted to seize thousands of weapons, arm enslaved people, and trigger a massive uprising across the South that would burn slavery to the ground. Brown brought just 21 men with him, a mix of white and black abolitionists, including his own sons. They cut telegraph lines, captured hostages, and took control of the armory. For a moment it worked, but the uprising he imagined never came. Local enslaved people didn't join, some out of fear, others because they never even knew it was happening. Within a day, Brown and his men were surrounded. Militia closed in, and then U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee stormed the armory. A brutal firefight followed. Most of Brown's men were killed or captured. 2 of his sons were dead. Brown himself was wounded and taken prisoner. He was quickly put on trial in Virginia, not just for murder and inciting rebellion, but for treason against the state. The verdict was certain. He was executed. 16 months later, the Civil War began. To the South, John Brown was a terrorist. To many in the North, he was a madman. But to others, he became a martyr. Frederick Douglass wrote that though Brown was white, in sympathy he is a black man, and as devoted as any of us could be to the cause of emancipation. Harriet Tubman called him the man who would free the slaves. And Union soldiers marched to war singing, "John Brown's Body." Did he break the law? Absolutely. But when the law itself protects injustice, when peaceful avenues are blocked, can violence be justified? Was John Brown a criminal or a prophet who saw the storm before it came?